So your deep dive, into that world of VMware Cloud Foundation architecture.
Yeah.
It's not just about, passing the VCF Architect 2024 exam. It's about building the mindset of a true cloud architect. And I think we've got some perfect resources here to help you get there.
Oh, yeah.
We've got your notes, the official VCF 5.2 Architect Exam Guide, and a really insightful blog post by Jeffrey Custers that I think you're going to love.
Absolutely. We're going beyond the basics here.
Yeah.
Think of this as a masterclass in design. Robust, successful cloud solutions.
Okay, so let's jump right in with the exam itself, that 2 via 0, 13.24 beast, 60 questions, 135 minutes. I know that might sound a bit intense, but the guide actually mentions that the timing includes adequate time for non-native English speakers, which I thought was kind of a nice touch.
Yeah, it is. They've clearly thought about making this a fair assessment of your skills.
Yeah.
Not just your language proficiency.
Absolutely. And of course, we're laser focused on VCF 5.2 here, so keep an eye out for any 5.2 specific features as you study. Now, the part of the guide that really caught my eye was this minimally qualified candidate section. It kind of got me thinking, what does that really mean in this fast-paced world of cloud technology? What do you think?
What is an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah.
They recommend 1 to 2 years of designing VMware solutions, plus at least 6 months of hands-on VCF experience.
Yeah.
I think those are solid starting points, but in my experience, it's not just about the quantity of time. It's the quality of your experience. Have you dealt with complex migrations? Have you tackled challenging security requirements? That's the kind of experience that truly prepares you for this, architect role.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, the guide itself emphasizes understanding the why behind things, not just memorizing facts, which, by the way, is music to my ears. It even encourages seeking help for complex situations, acknowledging that even the most seasoned professionals don't have all the answers. I think that's a really valuable lesson to internalize no matter where you are in your career.
It is knowing your limitations and when to ask for help is a sign of true expertise.
Absolutely. So speaking of expertise, let's look at how the exam itself tests those skills. The blueprint lays out 5 sections, but we're really focusing on 3: IT architectures, technologies, and standards, the VMware solution itself, and the big one, planning and designing that VMware solution. Now, when I saw these sections, I immediately thought of that blog post you shared by Jeffrey Custers. He has this incredibly clear way of explaining design principles, almost like he's preparing someone for the VCDX certification.
Oh, yeah, I see the connection. VCDX is the VMware Certified Design Expert certification. And while this exam isn't quite at that level, Jeffrey's insights are definitely relevant. He really gets to the heart of what it means to be a successful architect.
Exactly, and he does it by breaking down design into 3 layers: the physical, the conceptual, and the logical. The physical layer, as you can imagine, is all about those nitty-gritty details that make engineers kick. The hardware specs, the network configurations, all that good stuff.
Yeah, it's the foundation, upon which everything else is built, the blueprints, the nuts and bolts.
And then there's the conceptual layer. This is where it gets really interesting, because it's all about the why behind the solution. Why are we building this? What business value does it deliver? What problems are we solving?
And this is where I've seen a lot of projects go wrong. Skipping the conceptual phase is like building a house without a foundation. You might end up with something that looks good on paper, but it won't stand the test of time.
He uses this brilliant analogy in his blog post, of kids designing air-powered vehicles. And this 8-year-old dives right in, starts building with straws and tape. But her vehicle doesn't budge. Why? Because she never stopped to think about the concept, how air would actually propel the vehicle. It's a mistake I think we've all made at some point in our careers.
It's a trap that's easy to fall into, especially when you're excited to start building something new. But taking the time to think through the conceptual layer can save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Couldn't agree more. And finally, there's the logical layer, which acts as a bridge between the conceptual why and the physical how. This is where we translate those big picture ideas into technical blueprints that guide the actual implementation.
It's like creating a roadmap that outlines the components, the relationships, the data flow. Everything engineers need to bring the vision to life.
So we've got these 3 layers of design, and Jeffrey breaks down the conceptual layer even further into a few key elements: business drivers, RCARs, and APRS. Now, I know acronyms can be a bit intimidating, but trust me, these are worth understanding.
Absolutely. And you'll notice that Section 1 of the exam really focuses on these concepts. So paying attention here will pay off big time later on.
Exactly. So let's start with RCARs, which stands for Requirements, Constraints, Assumptions, and Risks. This is where we define the boundaries of our project. And believe me, getting this right is crucial.
It's often where projects go off the rails. Failing to properly define and account for RCARs can lead to scope creep, budget overruns,
Right.
and ultimately project failure.
Right, so let's break it down first up requirements. Jeffrey makes a really important distinction between functional requirements, what the system should do, and non-functional requirements, how it should do it. He also introduces this prioritization method called Moscow, which stands for must have, should have, could have, won't have. Have you used Moscow in your work?
I have, and it's a surprisingly effective way to get everyone on the same page. It helps you focus on what's truly essential, those must-haves that are non-negotiable for the project's success. Then you got your should-haves, important but not critical, followed by the could-haves, which are nice to have but not deal-breakers, and then, of course, the won't-haves, which you can safely park for future consideration.
It's such a clear way to manage expectations and avoid getting bogged down in unnecessary features, especially early in the design process. Now let's move on to constraints. These are, as Jeffrey puts it, non-negotiable limitations, and he means it. Things like budget restrictions, data center space, regulatory requirements, these are the realities we have to work within.
Constraints are like the walls of our sandbox. They force us to be creative and find solutions that meet the requirements within those limitations. Ignoring them is a recipe for disaster.
Imagine designing a VCF solution without accounting for data center space limitations, for example. That's a constraint that could derail the entire project.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so critical to identify and document all constraints up front.
Now on to assumptions. This is where things can get a little tricky, because assumptions are things we believe to be true, but haven't actually validated. They're potential blind spots.
Right. We might assume that a particular service is available, or that a certain level of performance can be achieved. But if those assumptions turn out to be false, the consequences can be significant. It's like building a bridge based on the assumption that the riverbank is solid rock, only to find out later it's actually quicksand.
Wow, what a visual. And that brings us to risks. These are the potential problems that could arise from those constraints or assumptions we just talked about.
Risks are the what-ifs of our design. What if the budget gets cut? What if that service we assumed was available isn't? Identifying these potential risks and coming up with mitigation strategies is key to a robust design. The exam guide even explicitly mentions the need to develop a risk mitigation plan. They're really hitting home on this, aren't they?
They are. It's clearly a critical skill for any architect, especially in the ever-evolving world of cloud computing.
It's all about anticipating challenges and having a plan B and maybe even C and D ready to go.
All right, so we've covered RCARs, the groundwork for our conceptual design. Now let's move on to AMPRS, which stands for Availability, Manageability, Performance Recoverability, and Security. These are the qualities that make a VCF solution not just functional, but truly successful in a real-world environment.
These elements are directly related to what users need and expect from a cloud solution. And let's be honest, expectations are high these days.
Higher than ever. So let's break down what each of these means in practice, starting with availability.
Availability is all about ensuring that your system is up and running reliably. Minimizing downtime and keeping those mission-critical applications accessible. Think of it as building redundancy and failover mechanisms into your design. If one component fails, another one steps in seamlessly.
So like having a backup generator for a hospital operating room, you never want the lights to go out.
Precisely. And in the context of VCF, this might involve deploying redundant components, implementing failover mechanisms, or distributing workloads across multiple data centers or availability zones.
So it's about creating a system that can weather the storm, whatever that storm might be.
Exactly. Now, manageability is another crucial aspect. We want our VCF solution to be easy to operate and maintain.
Because nobody wants their IT team spending all their time putting out fires and troubleshooting complex issues, right?
That's right. Manageability is all about automation monitoring and streamlined processes. It's about making the system as self-sufficient as possible, minimizing the need for manual intervention.
And that frees up your team to focus on more strategic initiatives.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about performance. Your system needs to meet the speed and responsiveness requirements of your users.
Because nobody likes a slow website or a laggy application. It's 2025. People expect things to happen instantly.
Exactly. So performance is all about tuning the system for optimal efficiency, selecting the right hardware, optimizing software configurations, ensuring the network can handle the load. These are all key considerations.
It's like fine-tuning a race car engine to squeeze out every last bit of performance.
That's a great analogy. And of course, we can't forget about recoverability. What happens if disaster strikes, a power outage, a server crash, a natural disaster? We need to be prepared.
Because those what-if scenarios can quickly turn into nightmares if you don't have a solid plan in place.
It's exactly. Recoverability is all about having a robust backup and disaster recovery strategy, data replication failover mechanisms, recovery time objectives, RTOs. These are all part of the equation.
So if something does go wrong, you can get back up and running quickly and efficiently.
Right. Minimizing downtime and data loss is critical. And finally, we have security, which is paramount in today's world. We need to protect our VCF solution and its data from unauthorized access and cyber threats.
Especially given the increasing sophistication of those threats.
Absolutely. So security is about implementing multiple layers of protection. Firewalls, intrusion detection systems, access controls, encryption. It's all part of a comprehensive security strategy.
It's about building a fortress around your data, making it as difficult as possible for attackers to penetrate.
Exactly. And here's the key takeaway. Whether you're designing for a single company or a multi-cloud environment, understanding and applying these AMPRS principles is essential for success. These are the qualities that will make your VCF solutions stand out.
They're the hallmarks of a well-designed, robust, and secure system. And they're all directly tied to those exam objectives we discussed earlier.
It all comes full circle. And speaking of tying things together, remember that logical design layer we talked about? This is where those AMPRS principles really come to life.
Right. It's where we take those high-level concepts and translate them into a blueprint that engineers can actually work with. It's like taking that abstract vision and turning it into a tangible reality.
And that's where the exam really gets into the weeds, especially in Section 3, where you're tasked with creating both logical and physical designs for VCF solutions. Think back to Jeffrey Custer's blog post, the analogy with the kids building air-powered vehicles. His 8-year-old daughter jumped straight into the physical design, grabbing materials and building without a plan.
While his 5-year-old daughter took a more thoughtful approach, sketching out her design, considering how the different components would work together.
And her vehicle actually worked. It might not have been the prettiest, but it achieved its purpose. That's a powerful lesson for us as architects.
It highlights the importance of that conceptual and logical design phase. It's about understanding the why behind the how.
Precisely, and that's exactly what this exam is evaluating. Your ability to think like an architect, to take those business objectives and requirements,
right,
and translate them into a technical solution that truly meets the needs of the stakeholders.
It's about seeing the big picture while also understanding the details, the nuances, the interdependencies, and that's where those design characteristics, availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security become our guiding principles.
They're not just abstract concepts, they're the driving forces behind every design decision we make. If we want to create a system that's truly robust and resilient, we need to keep them top of mind throughout the entire design process.
So let's dive into a few specific examples to see how these principles play out in real-world scenarios. Let's start with availability. The exam guide actually has a whole objective dedicated to designing for availability, both within an availability zone and across multiple availability zones. What are some of the common challenges you've encountered when designing for high availability in VCF environments?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is ensuring that the system can withstand component failures. Without impacting service availability, this often involves deploying redundant components, which can increase cost and complexity.
Right, it's a balancing act. You want to ensure high availability, but you also need to be mindful of budget constraints.
Exactly, and another challenge is properly configuring failover mechanisms. If those mechanisms aren't set up correctly, they might not work as intended when a failure occurs.
Which could lead to downtime and data loss, the very things we're trying to avoid.
And then there's the challenge of distributing workloads effectively across multiple data centers or availability zones. This can be complex, especially if you're dealing with legacy applications that weren't designed for cloud environments.
Right. It's not just about lifting and shifting. You need to carefully consider the dependencies between different components and ensure that they can communicate effectively across different locations. Speaking of dependencies, how do you typically approach manageability in VCF designs? How do you ensure that the system is easy to operate and maintain?
Automation is key. We try to automate as many routine tasks as possible, such as provisioning new virtual machines, patching systems, and monitoring performance.
That not only saves time and reduces the risk of human error, but it also frees up your team to focus on more strategic tasks.
Exactly. We also implement comprehensive monitoring systems to keep track of the health and performance of the VCF environment. This allows us to proactively identify and address potential issues before they impact users.
So it's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Precisely. And we also focus on streamlining processes to make it as easy as possible for the IT team to manage the system. This might involve developing clear documentation, implementing standardized procedures, or using intuitive management tools.
And that brings us to performance. How do you ensure that your VCF solutions meet the speed and responsiveness requirements of users?
Well, one of the most important considerations is selecting the right hardware. This includes things like the type and speed of the CPUs, the amount of RAM, and the storage capacity. We need to make sure that the underlying infrastructure can handle the anticipated workload.
Right, because skimping on hardware can come back to bite you later on. You might save money up front, but you'll end up paying for it in terms of performance issues and user dissatisfaction.
Exactly. And then there's software optimization. We need to make sure that the VCS software is properly configured and tuned for optimal performance. This might involve things like adjusting virtual machine settings, optimizing storage configurations, or fine-tuning network parameters. It's a continuous process of tweaking and refining. To squeeze out every last drop of performance.
It's like fine-tuning that race car engine we talked about earlier.
Precisely. And of course, load balancing is another important technique for ensuring performance. By distributing traffic across multiple servers, we can prevent any single server from becoming overloaded.
So it's about spreading the load evenly, ensuring that no single point of failure can bring down the entire system.
Exactly. And when it comes to recoverability, what are some of the best practices you recommend for designing resilient VCF solutions?
Well, as we discussed earlier, having a robust backup and disaster recovery strategy is crucial. This includes things like regular data backups, data replication to a secondary site, and well-defined recovery time objectives, RTOs.
I couldn't agree more. RTOs are particularly important because they define the maximum acceptable amount of time that it takes to restore a system after a failure. They help you prioritize recovery efforts and ensure that you're meeting the business requirements.
It's about setting clear expectations and ensuring that everyone understands the potential impact of downtime. What about disaster recovery testing? How often do you recommend testing those recovery procedures?
Testing is crucial. You don't want to wait for a real disaster to find out that your recovery procedures don't work as expected. We recommend testing at least annually, if not more frequently, depending on the criticality of the systems.
And those tests should be as realistic as possible, simulating a real-world disaster scenario to ensure that your team is prepared for anything.
Absolutely. And finally, let's talk about security. What are some of the key considerations when designing secure VCF solutions?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, security needs to be baked into the design from the very beginning. It's not something you can add as an afterthought.
Exactly. And that means implementing multiple layers of protection. Firewalls, intrusion detection systems, access controls, encryption. These are all essential components of a comprehensive security strategy. It's like building a fortress around your data with multiple layers of defense to deter attackers.
And it's not just about technology, it's also about people and processes. You need to have strong security policies in place. And you need to make sure that your team is trained on those policies.
Absolutely. Security awareness training is essential. Your employees are often the first line of defense against cyber attacks. They need to be able to identify and report suspicious activity.
Right, because even the most sophisticated security technology can be bypassed if an attacker can trick an employee into giving them access.
That's why it's so important to have a holistic approach to security, one that addresses both the technical and the human aspects.
And of course, security is a constantly evolving landscape. You need to stay up to date on the latest threats and vulnerabilities, and continuously adapt your security measures accordingly.
It's a never-ending battle, but one that's absolutely essential to winning in today's digital world.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the high-level concepts of AMPRS to specific design considerations for availability, manageability, performance recoverability, and security. But I think one of the key takeaways is that these principles are all interconnected.
They're all part of a larger puzzle, and they all need to work together harmoniously to create a successful VCF solution.
And those solution interoperability and compatibility requirements from that minimally qualified candidate section, they suddenly make a lot more sense in this context.
They do, don't they?
Yeah.
It's about understanding how all the pieces fit together, both within the VCF environment and within the larger IT ecosystem.
Right, because in the real world, it's rarely about building from scratch. It's about integrating VCF into existing landscapes, migrating workloads, ensuring that everything plays nicely together.
And that brings us to another important topic, the consumption strategy for VCF. The exam really emphasizes this aspect, asking you to consider how you'll design for automation. tenant design, self-service, and governance.
It's not just about building a functional VCF environment. It's about making it user-friendly, adaptable, and aligned with the needs of the business. It's about creating a VCF environment that people actually want to use.
Precisely. And that's where things like automation and self-service become so important. They empower users to provision and manage their own resources, freeing up IT staff to focus on more strategic initiatives.
And that can lead to increased agility and faster time to market.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But of course, with self-service comes the need for governance. We need to make sure that users aren't provisioning resources willy-nilly, creating security risks or exceeding budget limitations.
So it's a delicate balance. We want to empower users, but we also need to maintain control and ensure that everything is done securely and efficiently.
Right. And that's where tenant design comes in. We need to create logical boundaries within the VCF environment to isolate different workloads and ensure that each tenant has the resources they need without impacting other tenants.
It's like creating virtual apartments within a larger building, each with its own set of utilities and security measures. And I imagine workload mobility is a key consideration in this context.
It is. We need to be able to move workloads seamlessly between different tenants' environments and even cloud providers. This requires careful planning and design to ensure that applications can be migrated without disruption or data loss.
It's about creating a flexible and agile environment that can adapt to the changing needs of the business.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the importance of documentation. We need to document everything, the design decisions, the configurations, the procedures, to ensure that the system can be easily managed and maintained over time.
Because even the best design system can become a nightmare to manage if it's not properly documented.
I've seen that happen firsthand, and it's not pretty. Good documentation is like a treasure map that guides you through the complexities of the system.
It's an investment that pays off in the long run.
Absolutely. So as you can see, designing a successful VCF solution is a multifaceted endeavor. It requires a deep understanding of the underlying principles, the ability to think strategically, and a willingness to continuously learn and adapt, and that's what makes this exam so valuable. It's not just about checking boxes, it's about developing the mindset and skill set of a true VCF architect.
It's about becoming a master builder in the world of cloud computing.
Yeah.
It really is about thinking beyond just the technology itself. And that reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, the guide's emphasis on understanding the why. That really resonated with me because it's something Jeffrey Custers talks about extensively in his blog post. He argues that understanding the why, that conceptual layer of design, is crucial for avoiding costly mistakes and building solutions that truly deliver value.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. It's so easy to get caught up in the technical details, the bells and whistles, without stepping back and asking those fundamental questions. Why are we building this? What problem are we solving? Who are we solving it for?
Exactly, and it's not just about passing an exam. It's about developing the skills and the mindset that will make you a successful architect in the real world. And I think Jeffrey's blog post does a fantastic job of laying out that framework, using real-world examples and analogies that make the information stick, like those kids building air-powered vehicles. That image has stayed with me.
Oh, yeah. It's a brilliant analogy. It highlights the importance of thinking through the concept before diving into the technical details.
Right, because without that clear understanding of the why, you risk building a solution that's technically sound, but ultimately misses the mark.
It might be a beautiful vehicle, but if it doesn't move, it's not really achieving its purpose.
Exactly. So as you continue your studies for this exam, and even beyond that, as you embark on your journey as a VCF architect, remember to always keep the why at the forefront of your mind.
Absolutely. It'll guide your decisions, help you prioritize your efforts, and ultimately lead to solutions that are both innovative and impactful.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something Jeffrey Custers mentions in his blog post that I found particularly thought-provoking. He argues that assumptions, while often seen as risky in design, can actually be quite useful in real-life projects.
That's an interesting point. It seems counterintuitive at first, doesn't it? We're always told to validate our assumptions, to gather as much data as possible before making decisions.
Right. But Jeffrey suggests that in certain situations, making informed assumptions can actually help streamline the design process and lead to more efficient solutions.
Yeah, I can see how that might be the case. If you have a strong understanding of the domain, if you've worked on similar projects in the past, you can leverage that experience to make educated guesses that can save you time and effort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Of course, there's always a risk that those assumptions could be wrong. which is why it's important to document them clearly and revisit them as the project evolves. But I think it's a valuable perspective to consider that assumptions, when used judiciously, can be a powerful tool in the architect's toolbox.
It's a reminder that design is not always a purely linear, data-driven process. There's an element of intuition, of experience, of calculated risk-taking that comes into play.
Absolutely. So as you delve deeper into the world of VCF design, I encourage you to think about how you can leverage assumptions effectively, while also being mindful of the potential risks involved.
It's a balancing act, for sure, but one that, when mastered, can lead to truly innovative and impactful solutions.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From decoding that VCF architect exam to exploring the nuances of conceptual design, I hope this has given you a solid foundation for your VCF journey.
I agree. Remember, it's not just about memorizing facts. It's about developing the mindset and the skills of a true architect. Think critically, challenge assumptions, and never stop learning.
And if you ever find yourself struggling with a particularly challenging design problem, remember Jeffrey Custer's advice: sometimes the best way to find the solution is to step back, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, why? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of VCF architecture. We're confident you'll ace that exam and go on to design some amazing cloud solutions.